Today we're going to talk about why is querying getting harder, and is it actually getting harder? So first of all, what's going on? A lot of authors have been talking about the fact that typical response times for agents a couple years ago used to be anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes 4 weeks. Nowadays, it's more like 6 to 10 weeks, and some even say 3 months or more. Um, Long story short, it's getting. I said 3 months and then realized 10 weeks is longer than 3 months. I'm a little tired today. Long story short, it's getting harder and harder to query, especially over lots of time, because of the fact that a lot of times querying it used to be considered like you could send out a couple queries every month. Now it's like you have to wait every 3 months, which means querying not only takes longer, but it's gotten harder overall. Another thing that has made it harder is lack of response generally means no. Instead of saying, we're sorry, we reject your manuscript, formal rejections are actually getting more and more rare. It's actually more common for them to not respond to you at all. So if you get a formal rejection, actually consider yourself in a good spot. They actually cared enough to formally reject you instead of just ignore you completely, which sounds bad, but that is actually a positive thing. They cared enough to at least look at it and give you a response. And the funny part is full manuscript requests from agents and publishers alike used to be more common, in like the 75% success range. You'd at least get a request, even if you didn't get a guaranteed yes for publication, you at least got a full manuscript request. Nowadays, it's more like 25%. It has gone down drastically. There are a lot of reasons for that, and we're going to dive into that today. We're not only going to talk about why, but we're also going to talk about what you can do about it. This is not meant to be a discouraging video. This is meant to be a help you understand better how the publishing industry works, why it's getting harder, and what you can do to overcome that hurdle. Alright, so let's talk about the why. There are actually fewer people going into editing and publication jobs of the traditional set, myself included. I was in a traditional publication job and decided it wasn't for me and went the freelance route. And there are a lot of people who are deciding to either go freelance or not go into publication at all. As a result of that, traditional publication jobs and publishing firms are almost always constantly hiring, and that means they're going to be constantly overloaded. Same thing with agents. There are also a lot. Sorry. There are also a lot more new agents up and coming, and a lot more scam agents out there, unfortunately. So that also is making querying harder, due to it being easier and easier to become an agent. Another reason why querying is becoming harder is because more authors want to get published. Due to 2020, when almost everyone was staying home due to quarantine, almost everyone took their hobby of writing and turned it into a full-fledged book that they are now trying to get queried, and some people, sorry, my nose itches, some people are even continuing to write those novels and then continuing to produce. 2020 has then created this influx of people who are like, oh, I actually can do this if I just commit time. Which is great and fantastic, but it does mean that the amount of editors has gotten smaller and the amount of authors has gotten bigger. As a result, this is making it very difficult to work together. Another thing is shortages of supplies and inflation of purchasing and publishing those publishing supplies. So cost of paper, cost of printing, cost of ink, cost of the machines, has all gone up, as well as shortage of those supplies because of various manufacturing problems. This means that to publish a book, it is more money up front in general, which means that they are going to be much more picky and only going to want to pick books that are going to make their money back, or books that they think will make their money back. That's why we're going to talk about what we can do about it, because a lot of it is judgment based and not all of it's accurate. There are plenty of people who have gotten rejected and then later gotten accepted who are fantastically successful. It's all about what they think will be successful, not actually will be. Alright, what can you do about this current querying crisis? The first thing that you can do is make sure that your query letter and your writing sample are the best they can possibly be. They will not ask for a full manuscript request unless your query letter is absolutely beautiful and your writing sample has very few flaws and catches their attention right off the bat. With a query letter, you want to make sure that it is not more than 1 page. That immediately turns editors and publishers and agents off. They're like, nope, too long, too much work, no. You also want to make sure that your book is around the right length for the genre you're trying to go into and the age group you're trying to go into. For example, if you're trying to do a 200,000 word novel for a young adult, that's not going to fly. Generally, young adult is anywhere between 50,000 and 80,000 words. Same thing if you go under, if you're more like 30,000 words for a young adult novel, that's generally not going to fly. They're going to assume that you were either underwriting or overwriting, depending on if you overshoot or undershoot the mark. So first of all, check out your word count. See if you can find what problems there may be in your story, what is preventing it from reaching that optimal word count. If you don't think that it has any issues, maybe consider talking to some beta readers, consider possibly even talking to a professional editor. Just in general, look at what you could do to get the optimal word count, because that is actually going to get you in the door a little bit easier. That being said, your query letter also has to be incredibly well written. There has to be no grammatical flaws in it. Whereas with your writing sample, if you have 1 or 2 grammatical flaws, that's totally fine, and some can even be considered stylistic. However, with your query letter, it's a whole different story. It needs to look pristine and flawless and nice. Another thing is that Times New Roman 12 points font double-spaced is generally considered the go-to manuscript format. Unless your publisher or agent is asking for something else, go to that format. That format is going to be the goal most of the time, especially because of the fact that if they don't see that, they're going to assume that you don't care. Now, Arial can be used sometimes as a font as well. However, I will say Times New Roman is the default and generally what people submit as. With your writing sample, you also got to make sure that it really catches their attention. It does not start slow. You got to make sure your pacing is optimal for that. With your query letter, you also want to make sure that you cover all the basics. You want to cover what genre is your book, what age group is your book, how long is your book. Like I said, give a basic word count, and try to round up to the nearest 100, I would say, or the nearest 1,000. Some agencies do it differently, but 100 or 1,000 round up is good. And when I say round up, I don't mean round severely up. I mean like by a little. For example, if you have 81,250 words, I would say round up and say 81,300 words instead of saying like 82,000. Don't round up that drastically most of the time. Or if they ask you to round up to the nearest 1,000th, I would say just leave it at 81,000, because of the fact that 250 words is not going to make that much of a difference. I would never round up. I would always round down to the nearest 1,000th or 100th. You want to round down generally. And as far as query letter writing goes, make sure that it sparks their imagination, because they're not going to read your writing sample if their query letter doesn't spark their imagination. If they don't go, ooh, I want to read that, they're not going to bother reading the writing sample. So that's another good way to punch a hole through the publishing industry. Make sure that you catch their eye with the query letter. That means you've gotten in with the writing sample. Then if your writing sample catches their eye too, then that's when you start getting manuscript requests. That's when you're going to push through that traditional publishing barrier. Next thing you want to do is you want to ensure your whole manuscript is smoothed over for the biggest editing no-nos. Now the reason I say this is because you might get a manuscript request, but that doesn't guarantee you will get published. When I worked for Monster Ivy, a traditional publishing company that's up and coming, they're not a big publisher, but they're not a small publisher either. They're somewhere nice in the middle. They're slowly moving towards a bigger publisher though. Anyway, when I worked for Monster Ivy, they when they did manuscript requests, they had us all as intern editors read every one of the novels as much as we possibly could within a month. We were told to read at least half of all of them, but try to get through every novel. We generally had about 8 to sift through. And the reason I say 8 is because, again, there were plenty that queried, but only 8 got manuscript requests back. That tells you how few and how hard it is to get a manuscript request. And then even with those manuscript requests, we only took 4. And it was a close race. There were a lot of times where there was one in particular book that I just absolutely loved, but it had too many character hiccups and plot holes, and those are 2 big no-nos that make them go, sorry, those are too difficult and too much effort to fix considering how many resources we have. So I would say definitely make sure your manuscript is smoothed over of any plot holes. Now, I'm going to define all these real quick just in case. Plot hole is when there is a mistaken logic or a lack of logic or a logic leap from one point to another. For example, if there's a character who's like, oh, hey, I would never do X, Y, and Z, and then they just go do X, Y, and Z because they were told to, that doesn't make sense. That's also known as a character hiccup as well. Plot holes don't have to involve character hiccups, but they can. Character hiccups are when a character goes from being like, I would never kill a person, to being like, I will murder a person over this duckling. And it's like, that didn't make any sense. What just happened there? They're acting completely out of character for a out of character reason. Now, with plot holes, again, it doesn't have to involve character. It can also be things like your the way your plot is moving, certain, like I said, just logic leaps. For example, if it's taking place in a school and someone is, murdered or kidnapped from the school, generally there's going to be an inquiry, generally there's going to be problems, generally there's going to be an assembly, generally there's going to be people talking about it, generally there's going to be lots of police investigations. The police aren't just going to be like, well, I hope the kids solve it because we don't care. That's probably not going to happen. That is considered a plot hole. Another thing that you're going to want to make sure that your manuscript does not have, if you want to make sure you ensure you get from the manuscript request stage to the manuscript acceptance stage, is magic and world building issues. If you're a fantasy writer, magic issues. If you are just writing like a sci-fi or even just a fiction in a small town that you made up, you're going to have possible world building and magic issues. Again, these are for different genres, but the point being, when you build your own world, whether it's realistic fiction or fantasy, you're going to have some hiccups and flaws in the beginning, and you need to make sure those are all completely smooth before you hand in your manuscript. Because if they see any magic or world building leaps and problems, that's going to cause the editors and publishers to be like, I don't know if I actually want that. And which is sad, because it's not necessarily that your book is bad, it's just that your book needs to be better smoothed over. These are kind of ironing out the crinkles, I guess is a good metaphor for it. The last thing that you really want to make sure that you do super well, because this can make or break a story, is pacing. Are plot holes important? Yes. Are character hiccups important to avoid? Yes. Are magic and world building issues important to avoid? Yes. All those things are important. But ultimately, pacing is the most important wrinkle that you need to smooth out. The reason why is because, just like I said with the word count issue earlier, if it's shorter than the typical word count, it's likely you may be rushing things. Your pacing may be too quick. And it may just feel like you're like, oh, in the end. And that's not exciting. That's not good follow through. Pacing can also be too slow as well, very much so. You got to be careful with pacing that's too slow as well, and this is where your manuscript tends to look more bulky than the word count actually is. Again, it can be more bulky and it can be less than the word count. Know that there is a bias towards when you're less or more than the word count that is suggested. However, that doesn't mean you can't push through that and fix that. But generally it does indicate a pacing issue, which is part of the reason why editors kind of go, when they see a word count that is above or below. Now with slow pacing, you definitely want to make sure that you smooth things out, you take your time. Yes, that's good. But if you smooth things out and take your time too much, then it can definitely cause issues with the reader getting bored, the reader wanting to put the book down, and ultimately, biggest of all, the publisher wanting to put the book down and not wanting to pick it back up again, which is not great. So I would definitely say if your book is too slow, look at what scenes can be cut out that are not plot pivotal. If your book is too quick, I would say look at what scenes are summarized that should be given full depth and full length. If you have any other questions or suggestions for videos or lessons, please let me know, and I hope this lesson was helpful.